Welcome to Northlandia, a place to bring your curiosity because here you'll find curiosities. I'm Wyatt Buckner of the Duluth News Tribune, and I will be your guide as we discover the unique and fascinating stories here in the Northland. Here we celebrate the region's distinctive people, places, and history. In this episode, we explore the question, why is Duluth one of America's spookiest spots? Let's venture forth into Northlandia. Here to look at the spooky places of Duluth and the surrounding area, I'm joined again by arts and entertainment reporter Jay Gabler. Jay, welcome back.
Thanks, Wyatt. Glad to be here.
So before we get into this, I'm just curious because I know we've talked about on the podcast and off the podcast many forms of entertainment out there, but what is your stance on horror? Are you a big horror guy? Are you like into the spooky? Are you into that paranormal stuff? Are you kind of skeptical or not really a big horror guy? Where do you land on that kind of subject matter?
I'd say I'm a speculative fiction guy, definitely a bigger science fiction person than a horror person. When I was growing up as a kid, I was terrified of scary movies, any kind of haunted house. I remember I went through once as a kid with some family, and I just hung on to my Aunt Edie the whole time. And I was probably like a tween at this point. So it's not like I'm 5 years old. I was old enough to be able to handle a haunted house, but I was too scared. And so I didn't do anything really too spooky or scary for years and years and years until I was an adult living in Minneapolis some time ago. And I was actually dating someone who was a real thrill seeker. And so she wanted to go do the Haunted Basement, which was a big haunted experience that used to be an annual attraction in Minneapolis. Now they've kind of repurposed themselves as an organization. Point is, it was a very, 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 very scary experience. I'm like, all right, I can do this. I can do this. It's artists. It's just artists. It's theater kids. Just think about that, right? And I went through and it was very scary, but it was also fascinating because I got to see the creativity that went into that haunt. And I appreciated, horror is not just something you do like you put the world's spiciest sauce on your tongue just so you can feel something, right? It's actually a whole genre through which people explore a whole range of emotions and aspects of the human experience. And so once I crossed that bridge, I became more of a horror guy. And certainly in recent years, horror has become such a really mainstream genre. There's a whole streaming service, Shudder, and if you look at that, I've subscribed to that at times in the past, and the diversity of content that's out there now in the horror genre, it's not just, slasher movies, it's so much, much, much more than that. We're in the age of Jordan Peele. I mean, I need say no more. I feel like now you have to be a horror person if you care about art because there is so much incredible art that happens under the umbrella of horror.
Mm-hmm. And I know you're a big book guy. Is that translated, that fascination with horror, that blossoming interest led into the realm of books?
Very slowly. I've read Stephen King. I read The Shining. I finally went back and read for the first time Flowers in the Attic, which I remember like every girl in school carrying around when I was in high school. That is incredible, really messed up gothic horror. So I've kind of been going back and revisiting or visiting really for the first time some of the classics of the genre and reading some newer horror. Although, if I'm going to pick up a newly published book, probably it's going to be a Star Wars novel or a piece of literary fiction. Horror is still a niche interest for me in terms of reading.
Mm-hmm. But now moving into the relevancy of Northlandia, what prompted you to look at this question that we posed and kind of how would you go about answering that question or exploring it, I should say?
I will say the headline to this story, what makes Duluth a spooky place, is something that I sort of came to after deciding about the main subjects of this story, Kelly Florence and Meg Hafdahl, who are essentially Duluth-based pair. I say that because I feel like this is where a lot of their creative work has been based. This is where they met. This is where they became close friends. Meg now lives in Rochester. Kelly still lives in Duluth. And I know they're back and forth a lot, connecting and collaborating, but maybe it's a little biased because we're here in Duluth. But I think of them as being basically a Duluth pair. They're certainly experts on spooky stuff here in the Northland, but much more widely. And we can, get into a little bit more about what their work is, but I want to profile them and try to understand not just, why they do what they do, but why their story happened here in Duluth. What is it about Duluth that makes stories like theirs happen? I finally met them in person at the Catalyst Content Festival a couple of years ago, and they cut a distinctive profile, the two of them. I think if I had maybe just run into one of them, I might not have recognized, oh, that's Kelly and Meg, but seeing them together, you're like, oh, that's Kelly and Meg. So introduced myself at that point and have sort of had in the back of my mind, I should do an in-depth story on their fascinating friendship and collaboration.
Mm-hmm. And so as an overview, what makes them experts on the spooky stuff?
Their love for the genre, essentially. They met, I'll let them tell the story. This is a story that has been told many times. I asked them to tell it again for us. Here is Kelly explaining how they first met way back in the year 2000.
So Meg was working in a gift shop here in Duluth, and I was in browsing, and I was wearing an X-Files t-shirt. And all she had to say was, "Hey, I like your shirt." And it was like, boom, another fan. We exchanged emails, and the rest is history. She came over, I think, maybe a couple weeks later. We watched a bunch of X-Files episodes. We found out we have everything in common with love of all scary things. We both had read everything Stephen King had ever written. And we didn't start writing together for a couple more years, but we just found out we had all of this stuff in common.
So that is the story of how Kelly and Meg met. They quickly became friends and eventually started collaborating on projects. Initially, first they wrote plays together. Kelly had an opportunity to start directing shows at her alma mater, Cherry High School. Shout out to any Cherry listeners in our audience. And so they started writing plays together. And then eventually their friendship and collaboration evolved to the point where they realized, oh, they're always talking about their favorite spooky genre, books, movies, etc. And so they started a podcast called Horror Rewind, which is still going. It started in 2017, so they've been working on it for 7 years, have an incredible listenership, and it's really about all sorts of spooky media. And then they explained that once they were doing this podcast regularly and talking about all these spooky media, well, then they're doing research for it, sort of looking at, what's the truth or the inspiration or what might be true, might be stretched behind all of these books and movies we're talking about. And that turned into a series of books they've now read. There are several books in the Science of series where they look at tropes, people, aspects of horror in horror, speculative fiction, what have you, and they write about the science behind them, sort of explore science topics through the lens of these sort of subgenres of horror, speculative fiction.
And so what are some of their best known books? Because when we met with them, we got to see, was it some of them or all of them that they laid out for us? I wasn't entirely sure if that was all the books we got to see that they've written that they had for us, or if that was just a piece of it.
I think that was pretty much what they have. Yeah, they're best known for the several books in the Science of Blank series, and I think they brought everything they'd written in that series to our interview. And they have a new book called Travels of Terror, which sort of takes a new direction for them. They were traveling so much, promoting all these science of books, that they would visit different spooky spots. They would say, of course, given who we are and what our interests are, no matter what city we're traveling to across the country, we're going to look for the most interesting, potentially supernatural, true crime, historic spots that are going to speak to our fascination with the macabre. I'm, paraphrasing here, but this is generally the idea. And so based on those experiences, they wrote a brand new book called Travels of Terror. But we asked them what their, best known, most successful books are in the Science of series. And here's what they had to say. Kelly first.
Our personal favorite that we were Bram Stoker nominated for was The Science of Women in Horror. We like to lovingly call it our feminist manifesto because we got to write about all the things that we've always wanted to write about. Women in horror that have started the genre from Mary Shelley through all of the tropes, how women have been portrayed, and then talking about women who are currently in the field.
Our bestseller is The Science of Stephen King. People who love Stephen King are voracious for anything about him, which is great because he's very prolific and he writes a lot, so that's good. We loved putting that book together because we both, again, we love research, and so getting into his history, his biography, and sort of connecting what was going on in his life with the stories he was writing, the books, and then having the whole science angle on top of it, it was a really delightful book for us to do.
So let's jump to a question that usually listeners will know comes at the end of the podcast, but I feel like now's a good chance to bring it up now. What makes this a Northlandia story? Because I know you mentioned that you wanted to do a feature on them, and you do features all the time. So what prompted you to think that this is a good Northlandia fit and not just a typical feature?
I was curious to know, and I didn't really necessarily know going into the story, is there something about this region, about this city, about this area of the state and the country that makes this kind of story happen, where you have two people who are absolutely passionate about this interest of theirs, right? Horror, the macabre, speculative fiction, and they're really able to follow their passion and find success, find a national audience for their work, and yet stay here essentially in the Northland, in Minnesota. And it turns out the answer is yes. Yes, there is something about Duluth that made this story happen here and that has kept Kelly and Meg in this area, even as they have achieved national fame. Beyond which, maybe they just like the lake, like the rest of us do, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know too much about their leisure interests besides, horror, although I don't know if they have much time for leisure interests besides their very busy life writing books and hosting a podcast. But I did actually ask them, given that their story as, friends and writers has happened in Duluth, is that a coincidence? Meg answered first.
There are no coincidences.
Now, I remember, I think it might have been the first time you were driving up to my house. We were talking about some deep things, and I'm like, I believe in fate. And you're like, do you believe in ghosts? And I'm like, maybe.
So I mentioned Kelly and Meg's new book is called Travels of Terror, Strange and Spooky Spots Across America, and it includes some of the spots you would guess, like Salem, Massachusetts, home of the infamous witch trials, and Los Angeles with all the history and spooky stuff that has happened there. But, of course, Duluth is in there as well. And, given that they just wrote this book and had to select a limited number of especially spooky destinations across the country, I asked Kelly and Meg, what is it about Duluth that makes it such a spooky spot? Here's Meg's answer.
Well, we have to start with the lake. that huge, enormous lake just screams lake monster to me. But it has a very creepy aesthetic. And I think starting off from that point, the hills of Duluth make it, sort of hard to traverse sometimes. And I'm not even talking about when it's winter. And the architecture of Duluth, I think, too. I know, we both love going to the eastern part of the U.S., and there's older buildings there, and that's what it feels like here. It feels like this sort of wonderful place where all this history happened, and where history is, ghosts are.
As we're talking about, spooky things in Duluth, let's talk about the place we met them at, which was the St. Louis County Depot, supposedly home to several spooky stories and such. We had a chance to tour the building with them along with Haley Eidenschenk, also known as History Haley, a longtime listener to the podcast. You might recognize her as we had her on the podcast talking about Minnesota History along with Mike Schultz.
That's right. I asked Haley to pop out of her office. She was very generous with her time and did come out and talk to us and talk to Kelly and Meg and showed us around the depot and showed us some of the spookiest spots. And I wanted to talk to Haley because, it's always fun to talk to, someone who knows as much and is as entertaining as Haley is. But she is also one of the sources for Kelly and Meg's book, Travels of Terror. They talked to Haley about the history of the depot in particular. So I thought it would be great to meet up with Haley and have her talk about the depot and about, I asked Haley as well, what is it that makes Duluth such a spooky spot? Here's Haley's answer.
It's a lot of woods, and there's a lot of weird things that go bump in the night just by the nature of the woods being scary, and dark and teeming ecosystems full of other living critters that are not people and don't abide by people rules. It just feels like we're right where the forest meets the largest fresh body of water in the world. It feels like there's gotta be weird stuff on both ends that like rubs up against itself.
So getting into specifics of this possible spooky of Duluth, let's talk about our tour of the St. Louis County Depot that Haley walked us through, starting with the mysterious handprint high above the elevator on the 3rd floor.
The tall man. This would, of all the things, I'm losing my, if I'm sputtering here, it's because it's like, but that's right, Wyatt. It was a little disconcerting. Of all the things that I read about Duluth in the new book, Travels of Terror, this was a new one to me, that there is a figure known as the Tall Man who has been spotted in the Great Hall of the depot, which, as people who visited the depot are aware, the Great Hall is a very high ceiling structure. It's at least 2 stories high, and there's a second story of windows facing the front of the depot, which then looks out onto the library, Duluth Public Library across the street. And apparently someone at the library has looked across to the depot and seen a person passing beyond those windows, but didn't immediately realize until they came around to visit the depot sometime later that, oh, wait, those windows where they saw a figure passing actually are 2 stories above the ground. So it must have been a very tall man. And then there's further proof, if you were to be a believer, of the tall man's existence in the form of this handprint that we saw.
Mm-hmm. And it's the handprint you can barely see with the camera. I struggled to take a photo of that handprint. I don't know what it was about it. It was just the lighting, or maybe something spooky was in there, and I don't know, but I got the photo. So if you want to see a photo of that handprint, you can check out the article on our website, DuluthNewsTribune.com. At the very least, it would require a very tall ladder to get up there. If someone were to have faked it, that would require a lot of effort to fake that, I would argue. But
as Haley pointed out, the hand size seems a little larger than an average person's hand. So...
And tall.
And tall. We also went down to the former shower room, where people who were newly arrived in Duluth and were so new that presumably didn't have access to shower facilities elsewhere would shower, including immigrants to the community. And this is a spot that Haley told us gets a lot of interest from the paranormal investigators who come. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised to learn that paranormal investigators come with some frequency to the depot, and Haley is the person whose job it is to show these paranormal investigators around with their Ghostbusters-style equipment and their little, meters and all of that. And she said they tend to get a lot of response in this former shower room, as though perhaps some spirits are lingering around there who haven't seen fit to leave.
Mm-hmm. And she even had some photographic evidence that was shared with her of, I can't remember what your exact description of it in the article, but some kind of light abnormality that you can't really, that's weird. That's a weird reflection of light of some kind. Could be a ghost apparition of some kind, or it could just be a weird reflection of the light. It's a weird looking image.
Yeah.
Who knows?
And, Haley gives haunted tours of the depot. I'm sure you can inquire with the depot staff about when those are scheduled. And this is apparently a guest on one of those tours, took a bunch of photos, and only in one of them did this strange, unexplained light phenomenon occur. Is it a spirit? Who knows? Haley told us more about other sort of the greatest hits of supposed hauntings in the depot, but we were really lucky that she took the time to tell us a story that she does not tell on most tours of spooky stuff in the depot, and is so long and creepy that I couldn't even work it into the printed article. So for people who are listening to this podcast, we're about to give them a complete exclusive ghost story. Just for context, she told this story to us when we were standing in an area that typically visitors wouldn't visit in the depot. There are a number of organizations headquartered in the depot, and so there's an hallway off the Lake Superior Railroad Museum. That's not really part of the museum, but it's a hallway you would use to access the offices of staff at the Lake Superior Railroad Museum and the Duluth Superior Symphony Orchestra, or the DSSO, which is also based at the depot.
This is the hallway. You can go to the DSSO offices here, and that's not spooky at all. But it was probably 2 winters ago, maybe 3 now. I was taking holiday decorations down from the Great Hall and taking them down to a storage room at the end. And there used to be a set of double doors here. You can see the frame still. And I was carrying totes, and as I was making my way down here, I could see through the crack between the 2 doors. There's just enough light that I could see a guy standing there. And the door's locked. I go to pull it, like with my tote still in my arm, and it's locked, and I'm immediately upset. I'm like very grumpy because someone is down this hallway. They would have had to lock the door behind them. It's like, that was inconvenient for you. It's inconvenient for me. I'm inconvenienced. It's 10 a.m. I'm very grumpy. So put the totes down. I like pull my keys out of my pocket, open up the door, fling it open, mad. Pick the totes back up. I'm like, I'm grumbling the whole time. I'm like, I can't believe that guy. Go down into the storage room, unlock it, turn the lights on, put my stuff down on the cabinet, and turn around, and like slowly the gears in my head are turning, and I'm thinking, it's like, there was a guy in the hallway who locked the door that I just saw. That's why I'm mad. Why didn't I come across a guy while I was walking through the hallway? Like, there's 2 places they could have gone and they're not in there. So I'm walking back out the hallway by myself, and it like begins to occur to me that I maybe saw something kind of spooky and I'm scared now. So you know how when you're like scared, or like when you were a kid scared, you like run up the stairs and you like feel like something right behind you? Not nearly as satisfying to take the elevator back up. You're just scared in a box. So I like get back upstairs and go into the office, and I ask my coworkers like, could you help me bring some of the Christmas stuff downstairs, please? And she's like, yeah, absolutely. She helps me. It's like, are you okay by the time we get back down? Like, are you good? You like are sweaty and weird. I'm like, yeah. I think I like maybe saw a ghost in the hallway when I was down here by myself. And Kristen was really pleased that I waited until we were both down here to tell her. She's like, oh, geez, thanks. All right. And then that was the last load. So thankfully she did not have to come back down again. And I didn't make her go by herself even once. So I'm kind of a great coworker, I think, is the moral of the story.
I can't speak to a great coworker, but I imagine she's at least an entertaining one. Like, she's not a boring coworker by any means, at least talking with her from our end.
Yeah.
And that hallway, fun extra fact, leads to the space where they actually filmed Rescuing Christmas. So I wonder if they experienced any paranormal things during their time while filming there. Who's to say?
I don't know. I'll have to ask the producer next time I talk to her.
I don't recall hearing any ghost happenings on the film set, but, fun little fact that just past that hallway, they filmed a movie there.
Yes.
Now back to Meg and Kelly, since the story is very primarily focused on them. As you said, it's kind of a feature on them. What's coming next for them?
Well, funny you should ask, because I asked them, and they told me about an opportunity for anyone who is in Duluth and is interested in their new book and in their knowledge of spooky stuff in Duluth to get a little bit of that knowledge firsthand. Here's Kelly.
We are going on a book tour with this book, and our first stop, we're kicking it off here in Duluth, Minnesota at the bookstore at Fitkers. If you buy a book, that's your ticket for the walking tour that we're going to take you on. A little bit downtown Duluth, we won't go too far, some surprises along the way, and we can't wait to have everybody come out and meet us.
And that's October 1st.
So yeah, they have that new book, Travels of Terror, and if you're interested in checking out their earlier books, I've been mentioning, we're sort of interested in the spooky stuff here, the horror aspect of their work, but they're also interested in true crime and not true crime, as in mystery novels. So they also have books on the science of Agatha Christie and the science of serial killers.
Have my interest there.
Actually, that's right.
That would have been a helpful book to have when my wife and I made a feature film about a serial killer. That could have been helpful.
Yeah, you could have one of the characters be like, fun fact, you actually cannot analyze a blood sample this way.
Fun fact, we were nervous for a bit while we were researching for that, making that movie, though. We were going to get flagged by FBI on the things we had to Google for serial killers.
Yeah, see, and if you have a book, it's just like you're just reading a book. No
That's
one
true.
knows what your motives are or what. I should just stop talking.
Don't want our phones to hear us. So before we wrap it up here, Jay, as we're talking about spooky happenings in the Duluth area and surrounding, I'm curious, we've talked about, your interest in horror and such, of the entertainment side of things and just general interest, but have you had any personal experiences with anything spooky or anything that seemed spooky or unsettling, especially if it was in the Duluth area? It's okay if not. I'm just curious if you've experienced anything like that, or at the very least something that's given you pause. You're not sure, but maybe at the very least made you wonder. Like, for example, early on this very podcast, we've talked about the ghost stories at the Two Harbors Blackwoods. That was episode 18 of the podcast. And literally while we were recording that interview, there were some weird sounds that I swear are not normal sounds that I've done a countless number of audio interviews and such, and I still cannot tell you what those sounds are, but they're not so far-fetched that they can't be a plausible sound that was made. I just very confused by it. I would have freaked out if I heard that sound again at the depot while we were filming. I was waiting for that to maybe happen, but that's the closest thing I could think of in recent memory.
So, yeah, as you mentioned, Wyatt, I'm a fan of spooky movies and to some extent books. And so I'm going to mention an experience I've had that also has a movie reference to go with it that's timely because Beetlejuice came out recently and is doing boffo at the box office, proving that people are still fascinated with that whole character and aesthetic. So in the Beetlejuice universe, there are moments when people step outside of the Deet's house and find themselves in this wasteland with these, with these worms crawling about. It's sort of like a goth Dune.
Yeah.
the best description I have. And then you'll run back inside and slam the door. Well, I had an experience not dissimilar to that in the house where I live. Yes. It's not my house. I rent. With my.
But you live there.
Yes, yeah, it's true. It's true. And there is an attic. You rent a house, and the agency I rent from doesn't give you a ton of information. They kind of walk you through once you sign a lease. They're like, all right, have fun. And so I thought, well, attic. I wonder if there's any usable space up there for storage, or who knows. It looked like from the outside there was a smaller attic, but I thought, well, let me check this out. So I opened the door to the attic the first day that I moved in, and first of all, the backside of the door is covered with this heavy padding. So already that's a little freaky. Why do you need that door that padded? Well, I mean, the answer is insulation, right? There is a mundane explanation of this, but it's still unexpected. You're like, oh, why all this heavy padding and insulation on the attic door? And then the stairs have just all sorts of stuff on it. Not necessarily creepy stuff, but clearly people have been tossing everything from, paint buckets. You just get that kind of stuff, household stuff, onto the stairs with the expectation that nobody's going to be using these stairs. And who knows what previous tenants or whatever the property management company has been doing. I'm like, oh, well, why the assumption that no one would use these stairs? And so I'm curious. So I work my way carefully up the stairs and poke my head up into the attic, which is indeed a small attic, but there is an attic there with windows. So it's during the day, thank goodness. So you can see what's up there. And the entire floor of the attic is covered with what looks like if you ask Tim Burton to build a set with a creepy desert that worms might be crawling through. That's sort of what it looks like to me. And the entire floor is evenly covered with this very weirdly artificial and yet with this texture surface. And it was not at all what I was expecting. And for a moment there, I did have this kind of experience like you have when you open the door in the Deet's house in Beetlejuice and you look out and whoa, you're in this whole other landscape. Again, there is, if you want to be boring about it, a mundane explanation, which is that you can spray the floor of an attic with insulation material, in this way. And I imagine it's relatively cheap to do and, fairly effective. The house is fairly well insulated. It holds heat, which is nice. So, there is an explanation for it. I don't actually think that my attic is haunted, but when I see Beetlejuice now and they open that door and look out on that eerie landscape, I still do have a moment where I'm like, that's my attic. They're in the attic.
Maybe somebody who lived there previously wanted to recreate that and it was intentional. Probably not.
Or maybe it's not insulation and it actually is passed through to another dimension that you need to be issued a manual to survive in. And you better read every page. That's what I know. If anyone ever gives me a manual to what to do after you die or after you step into your own attic, I'll read it.
All right, Jay, I think we'll wrap up there. Thanks so much for joining us. This is probably the shortest distance we've traveled for Northlandia in quite a bit. So I'm curious to see where we end up next.
Well, I'll just give you a hint, Wyatt, and say I'm going to be crossing the border into another state of mine and of the Union.
All right. We'll wrap it up there. Thanks.
Thanks, Wyatt. And happy early Halloween.
And thank you for joining us on this venture into Northlandia. To read the article for this week's column, as well as see photos, visit DuluthNewsTribune.com/topics/Northlandia. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to support us, consider becoming a subscriber to Duluth News Tribune at duluthnewstribune.com/subscribe. Join us again next time and discover the extraordinary stories that you just might miss. You're on the right place at the right time, ready to step off the beaten path and no rush to return, here in Northlandia.